France, ranked 4th in the world by FIFA, twice champions and tournament giants, have qualified for a 16th time in Qatar, looking to defend their title out in the desert. The French were a part of the inaugural tournament down in Uruguay, and they opened the cup with a flyer, winning 4-1 over Mexico. They would not win another game until they hosted in 1938. They would lose to both Argentina and Chile in 1931, and then lose as well to the Austrians in the only 90 minutes they played in Italy 1934 by a scoreline of 3-2, although it would take extra time to see them out. After beating Belgium on home soil in 1938, they would then be knocked out without making much of an impact versus holders Italy. They would likewise underwhelm in Switzerland in 1954 after not qualifying for Brazil 4 years previously. Losing to Yugoslavia 1-0 and then beating Mexico was not enough to see them into the knockout rounds. Enter Just Fontaine, who still holds the record for the most goals scored at a single tournament. After not impressing many in the tournament before this one, Fontaine opened the World Cup in Sweden with a hat-trick versus Paraguay in a 7-3 rout that put the rest of the world on notice. They were unable to avenge their loss in Switzerland to Yugoslavia, despite Fontaine netting twice more, losing 3-2 in the second match. He would net again in the 2-1 win versus Scotland to see them through the group stage. Northern Ireland was up next, and they steamrolled right over the men from the British island, 4-0, seeing Fontaine bag 2 more goals. Despite flying high, they would come up against everyone's nemesis at the World Cup for the first time, but certainly not the last. Brazil would score 5 times, with Pelé, of course, getting on the score sheet, but Fontaine would net 1 as well. They then faced West Germany in the for-the-badge third-place match in a wild one that ended 6-3 for the French. Fontaine would net 4 more times, bringing the tally to 13, but he wouldn't see the pitch in a World Cup match ever again, and still remains a beloved piece of World Cup history. Les Bleus would skip the tournament in Chile, but were back for the short trip across the English Channel for the 66th edition. Unfortunately, it would prove quite disappointing. A tough 1-1 draw was not what was needed against Mexico in the first game, because 2-time champions Uruguay were up next, and they would fall 2-1. Then the hosts and eventual champions would dump them out in a rather forgettable showing for the French on English soil. Once again drawn against a former champion and a host who would go on to lift the trophy for the first time, it was not promising down in Argentina 1978. They opened with a tough loss 2-1 to the Italians, and would follow it up with a loss to the hosts by the same scoreline. But it would see the first goal for Michel Platini at the World Cup Finals. Despite beating Hungary 3-1 in the third match, they would bow out of this one at the group stage. 4 years later would represent another short trip for the French to the south for Spain 1982. An opening match loss versus England 3-1 was the worst possible start, but they would bounce back against Minnows Kuwait with a resounding 4-1 victory. A draw with Czechoslovakia 1-1 would see them through to the second group stage, that being the format in 1982. They would cruise through this part of the tournament with a narrow 1-win victory over Austria that they followed up with another 4-goal effort over Northern Ireland, sending them through to the semi-final to face the mighty Germans. This one is widely regarded as one of the greatest matches in World Cup history. It went 1-1 into overtime, where the game then exploded with France leading by 2 goals by the 98th minute. Just 10 minutes later, it would be knotted up at 3, and the contest went to penalties. This was the first time that a match at the World Cup Finals was decided by pens, and the French fell just short, having their 6th shot blocked after both teams netted 4 of 5, and the German response sunk the French and relegated them to the 3rd place game against Poland. It would be another close one, but Les Bleus would lose and finish in 4th place. The French were back for Mexico 1986 with a vengeance, but had a mean-looking group that they would open with a 1-0 win over the Canadians. A tough 1-1 draw with the Soviet Union in the second game left them in prime position to win the group, which they would do with a 3-0 victory over Hungary. This meant they faced Italy, whom they had never beaten on the world stage in the next match, and the 2-0 win was enough to see them through into another game with Brazil. It would take penalty kicks in this quarterfinal after going to overtime 1-1, and they would triumph 4-3. Les Bleus would once again find themselves against the West German menace and would be unable to net in another loss at the semifinal stage. This set up the third place game versus Belgium, and it would take extra time, but the 4-2 victory meant a third place finish to match their best ever. It would be 12 long years and France would not qualify in 1990 or 1994, but were hosts in 98. Drawn into a group they were supposed to win on paper, they still had to go out and perform. Zinedine Zidane and Thierry Henry had arrived, and Les Bleus would sweep past the South Africans 3-0 in the first match. Henry would net his second and third in the 4-0 rout over Saudi Arabia in the second game, despite Zidane receiving a red card at the 71st minute. Denmark represented the sternest test in the group, and they would pass 2-1, even without Zidane. This took them into the round of 16 versus Paraguay, where it would take extra time for them to scrape through 1-0 with a Laurent Blanc goal in the 115th minute. Italy awaited in the quarterfinal and would be another tough, tight game. This one went 0-0 to penalties, and they converted 4-5 to go through to a third semifinal running in as many cups. The mighty Croatian debutants flying high into the semifinal would score just before halftime off the boot of Davor Sukerman to stun the French. It would take two magical moments from the unlikeliest of sources. Lilian Thuram comes out of nowhere with the only 2 goals he ever scored in a French shirt in 147 appearances spanning 14 years. A couple of thunderbolts would sink the Croatians and send the French to the final for the first time in their history. Here they met the Brazilians and young Ronaldo. Zidane would pop up on not one but 2 corners with smashing headers to take the 2-0 lead. Late on they were starting to believe, but Brazil were pressing when Emmanuel Petit notched a third on the break to send Les Bleus into delirium on home turf and see them lift the cup, champions of the world. The curse of the holders is real, and it descended upon the French in the Far East for Korea-Japan in 2002. An absolute shock of a loss to surprise Senegal in this tournament would start things off, and were clear warning signs. A tepid 0-0 with Uruguay left them needing a result against the Danes in the third match. It would be another disappointing performance and a 2-0 loss, seeing them crash out, with most citing superstition as the cause. 4 years later, the champions on home soil were staring down their last cup in Germany. A touchy 0-0 with Switzerland opened the tournament for Les Bleus in Germany. They would then face the South Koreans and would be unable to win again in an underwhelming draw 1-1. It would need a win over the men from Togo in the third group stage game, and 2 Arsenal men stepped up, Patrick Vieira and Thierry Henry, both bagged for the 2-0 win to send them through. The Spanish awaited for the first time in World Cup history, and Ribéry and Zidane would ensure they win against La Roja, alongside Vieira, who scored for the second game running. Thierry Henry would net the only goal versus the Brazilians in the quarterfinal with a looping run round the back post on a free kick to volley home for the 1-0 win. They would then face Portugal in the semifinal, and Zidane would get the game's only goal to see the French into another final against an absolutely miserly Italy who had not been scored on in the entire tournament, barring an own goal versus the US of A. This match is remembered in infamy for Zidane's moment of madness, but it's worth mentioning that he also converted a pin in the coolest of fashions, Panenka style, early on in this one, looking smooth as glass, ice in the veins on the grandest stage. What a legend. It was not meant to be, however, and the Italians would equalize and go on to win in penalties to lift the cup. The golden generation of 98 had moved on for the most part by South Africa 2010, and it would represent a bit of a rebuilding period as the showing at this tournament for Les Bleus was forgettable at best. The 0-0 draw with Uruguay to start the tournament wasn't promising, but the 2-0 loss to Mexico in the second game was as damaging as it could be. They would need a result versus hosts in the third match, but it wasn't meant to be, and they went down 2-1, crashing out at the group stage for only the second time since 1982. 4 years later, Les Bleus were back with a point to prove in Brazil 2014. Karim Benzema would net twice in an opening 3-0 win over Honduras. They then put the tournament on notice with a resounding 5-2 win over Switzerland, and despite the tepid 0-0 draw with Ecuador in the third match, they were through to the next round to face Nigeria in the last 16. Paul Pogba would score as they cruised 2-0, and it was on to the quarterfinal. There, they faced the German nemesis once again, but they wouldn't be able to muster a goal and were dumped out 1-0. Add Kylian Mbappe to the squad, and the French looked really mean coming into Russia 2018. They were somewhat underwhelming, however, in the group stage, starting off with a win over Australia 2-1. Mbappe would bag his first goal in the World Cup to beat Peru 1-0, and then they would draw Denmark 0-0 to kind of fly under the radar going into the round of 16. With Argentina and Messi on the docket, they would turn up with style in an absolute thriller. It went back and forth, Griezmann, then Di Maria, Mercado, then Pavard. But Mbappe would net twice as well to make it 4-2 from 2-1 down in 11 minutes. Despite Aguero getting another in the 93rd, it would end 4-3, and the French were through to the quarterfinals. Another former champion awaited in Uruguay, but La Celeste were unable to muster much, and France won 2-0 to press on to yet another semi-final. Kevin De Bruyne and Belgium awaited in a hotly contested match that France just edged 1-0, and it was on to the final versus the endurance mid of Croatia. The first ever own goal in a World Cup final opened the scoring, but the lead wouldn't last, and Croatia leveled on 22 minutes. A penalty restored the French lead, and they went 2-1 into halftime. After the pitch invaders were seen off, Pogba and Mbappe would both net to increase the lead to 4-1, and a position they would not surrender. Croatia scored again, but it was not enough, and France lifted the cup for the second time in their history. The mighty French juggernaut looked to throw off the curse of the holders and defend their title in Qatar. They will be licking their chops in what appears to be a favorable group draw. They face Australia, Denmark, and Tunisia in a group they would expect to win. Giroud, Griezmann, and Varane can surpass the most appearances for Les Bleus, each with 6 more matches to have the most caps, but it will take another tournament like the legendary Just Fontaine to surpass the goals. Can France defeat the superstition and repeat as champions, or will the curse take hold once again?